In this video, we're going to look at the differences between the bandsaw and the scroll saw. We're going to look at some of the advantages and disadvantages, and we're also going to look at some of the situations where we would choose to use the one as opposed to choosing the other. Now, before we get started, it's worth noting this is a general overview. There are going to be exceptions to the rule here, and we're well aware of that. So, you're welcome. Put it in the comments section, some of the exceptions, and it's just to give a general idea. And we're really talking about the average. And we know that, you can get bigger scroll saws. We know that you can get smaller bandsaws. So some of the things that we explain may not be relevant to yourself. But let's have a little look at it. Let's have a look at some of the advantages of the scroll saw and explain some of the situations we would use them in. And then we'll look at some of the disadvantages of the scroll saw and the advantages of the bandsaw and the situations that we would choose to use a bandsaw. We'll also highlight then some of our other videos where I've demonstrated making something using a scroll saw when in reality it would be easier and quicker to make it using a bandsaw. So let's get into it then. First of all, let's have a look at the advantages of the scroll saw. Now, out of the two, I would use the scroll saw for more of the work that I am doing than I use the bandsaw. But I don't always use the scroll saw because it does have some advantages. The first advantage then we'll highlight of the scroll saw is very much to do with the quality of the cut that you get. Now, we use a Hegner Multi-Cut 2S. We use a reverse tooth number 9 blade. And that setup gives us a very fine finish. Fine enough that we do not need to use a belt sander or hand sanding before we do our hand carving. So that saves us quite a lot of time. You haven't got to worry about doing that hand finishing or that machine sanding before going on to your carving. So that then is a big advantage for using the scroll saw. The next one then, different materials. Now, because scroll saw blades are relatively inexpensive, you can adapt your work to work in metal and plastic quite easily. Now, with that one, there is a proviso because, of course, you can get bandsaw blades that are suitable for metal and you can cut plastics using your bandsaw as well. So I'm not really going to put that down as an advantage to the one or the other. What I would say is that the blades, I think that's more relevant. The blades for the scroll saw, they are generally cheaper than blades for your bandsaw. Having said that, bandsaw blades would generally outlast scroll saw blades. So in terms of cost, probably, it works out that there's not too much difference when it comes to blades, because bandsaw blades are more expensive, but they would generally last a lot longer than scroll saw blades. So yeah, that's another sort of area. I don't think we're going to give an advantage or disadvantage to either one. The key area of difference is the design of the bandsaw. Being a belt means you can do your external cuts, so cutting around things. You're not able to drill a hole and then feed the blade through in the same way as you can do with the scroll saw, that pierce work. So if you're working on internal cuts, the scroll saw has a definite advantage because the bandsaw just can't do internal cuts in that way. As the scroll saw, it can do those internal cuts for you. So if you're doing that pierce work, the one to go for is definitely the scroll saw. Any internal cuts, you'll be using a scroll saw as opposed to a bandsaw. Next area is the turning angle. As a general rule, scroll saw blades are more narrow, they are thinner, there's less sort of distance between the front of the blade and the back of the blade than a bandsaw blade. That means you've got a tighter turning circle. So if you're having to do very extreme sort of points or very extreme turns, tight circles, the scroll saw has a clear advantage over the bandsaw. Smaller blades, thinner blades, they got more precision for doing that type of work. So yeah, if you're doing things like that, scroll saw is the way to go. Final one then, in terms of the advantage of the scroll saw, is the general size. And again, this is a generalization, but I'm going to throw it in there. Scroll saws are usually smaller than bandsaws, but there's always exceptions. You can get big scroll saws, you can get small bandsaws. But generally speaking, the average scroll saw is smaller than the average bandsaw. So that is an area where there's a difference between the two. But I'm not going to say it's an advantage or a disadvantage, because being larger in size gives the bandsaw some advantages. So let's go through those. The speeds that you can work with, that you can cut with on a bandsaw, is faster than a scroll saw. Now again, it's a generalization, and people are going to look at that and say, whoa, that's not right. But from personal experience, when I first started, I was using a bandsaw, and the bandsaw, having a stronger blade, having a thicker blade, it can cut the outlines more quickly than the scroll saw. When I first started using the scroll saw, in some ways it could be a little bit frustrating in comparison to a bandsaw, because you had to go that much more slowly to do your cuts, as the bandsaw will go through more quickly. The disadvantage of that additional speed is that you don't get as precise a finish, which means that afterwards, when using a bandsaw, you have to use something else like a belt sander or hand sanding to take out the saw marks. So, the speed, I would say, from personal experience, is with the bandsaw. The bandsaw will cut more quickly. The precision, the quality of the finish, I would say, is with the scroll saw. So depending on what you are looking for, the one or the other can be more suitable. The other part then, that the bandsaw has a clear advantage, and that comes down to the thickness of the woods that we use. And I refer back to one of our videos that I made. I demonstrated making things like a miniature grandfather clock on the scroll saw. Now, if I was going to actually do that here at the workshop on a regular basis, I would actually use the bandsaw, because the bandsaw can cut that thicker piece of wood with greater ease than the scroll saw. It can deal with that more easily, and it would be quicker to cut it on the bandsaw and then sand it on the belt sander than it is to cut it all out using the scroll saw. So, the thickness of wood you can work with on a bandsaw, and again as a general rule, is greater than on a scroll saw. The scroll saw usually has a limited sort of length to the throat, which means it's great for thinner pieces of wood, but once you get beyond a certain thickness, the bandsaw is a better option. So if you're working in larger pieces of wood, in greater thickness of woods, there comes a point when I feel you are better off working with a bandsaw than a scroll saw. From a personal point of view, as I said, we're working in pieces of wood that are less than ½ an inch thick, so the scroll saw is usually the preference for us to use. But there's always exceptions, and there are pros and cons with using both a scroll saw and a bandsaw. Hopefully some of those ideas are useful. Let us know in the comments section. I dare say there are a few things that we said that are a little bit controversial, shall we say. What's your preference? Do you enjoy working with the scroll saw or the bandsaw? Hopefully it may be useful as well for anybody who's not sure whether they need to add a bandsaw to their equipment or a scroll saw to their equipment. Maybe some of those thoughts will point you in the right direction. Thank you again for watching. As always, we'll be back again soon with more videos. Thank you all again.